Dreyer, the director of Karuna Center for Peacebuilding here in Amherst. And we at Karuna Center are just delighted to be co-hosting this series with Critical Connections that we've called Transforming This Moment, Examining Our Collective Responsibility. We're trying, as we have these conversations, to think how we can get out of a bit of a bystander mode and feel our collective responsibility and think through what we as citizens can do. So we've had a number of these talks, always coupled with rich conversation over this past academic year. This one we've called U.S. Foreign Policy in the Middle East, Trends and Trajectories in the Trump Era. And it feels, I think we planned this title a while back, but it feels more timely than ever as the situation is fast changing and getting more complicated by the minute. So Melika will introduce our speakers in just a sec. Very quickly, for those of you who don't know what Karuna Center is, we've been located in Amherst since the mid-'80s. We work on peace building and reconciliation in conflict-affected areas around the world, and increasingly feel an obligation to work on divides in our own country as well. So we're delighted to partner on this series. Quick plug is that our reconciliation work in Rwanda is featured in this month's issue of National Geographic, and it's a special issue on race, and it's altogether a really important issue, I think. So apart from the photographs of our wonderful participants in Rwanda, I urge you to have a look. The format for this evening is going to be, Melika is going to interview our speakers, and then we will have some short time in smaller groups for you all to just process what you've heard, pool your questions, and then we'll open it up for a broader conversation. So really look forward to sharing the evening with you. Oh, one other thing. Amherst Media we're very grateful to have them here filming this for Amherst Community TV. They will not film the small discussions. We hope everybody's comfortable with appearing before your community. But if for any reason you're not, please let me know and we'll have you sit in a corner where you would be off screen. Okay? Great. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Melika Samdani. I'm the Director of Critical Connections, an organization here in the Valley that puts together events on issues related to American Muslims and other minority groups. And we are also very blessed to be partnering with the Karuna Center over the past few years. Our event today is, as you know, about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. And every now and then, or at least once a year, we do try and have one event that focuses on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for a number of reasons. And the most obvious one is because our government's policies in the region affect millions of lives, and sometimes not always very positively. And as U.S. citizens, it is great to have a more nuanced understanding of what we hear sort of from beyond the headlines and beyond the sort of sensationalized media coverage, and really understand the issues so that we're able to hold our representatives accountable for some of the policies that are carried out in our name. Another reason that we feel like it's important to engage the community in this conversation is also because how the nature of our government's involvement in the Middle East has direct implications for our security here in this country and any blowback that we get in terms of militancy. So we have a real stake in this process. And lastly, again, because of different US interventions that we've seen over the past decades, the way it's covered in the media and the way our policymakers talk about those interventions has direct impact on intercommunal relations here in the US between Muslim and non-Muslim communities. It has direct impact on the way we devise our national security policy, our immigration policy, and who we perceive as the other and who we consider a threat. So it's really wonderful to see you all out here sort of to sort of participate in this discussion, which we hope after the first moderated part will be very interactive, and we look forward to your question answers and also your small group discussions. So in order to help us understand the complexity of US foreign policy in the region, we are joined by two incredible scholars and experts on US foreign policy. First, to my right, we have Dr. David Mednikoff. He's quite local, from about 10 minutes away. He is the Director of Middle Eastern Studies and Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. His research deals with broad connections between legal and political ideas and institutions at the national and transnational levels, particularly as these relate to current issues in the Middle East. He is currently completing 2 book manuscripts on the politics of the rule of law in 5 Arab societies. And then to my left, we have Dr. Osama Khalil, who is an associate professor of history at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He is currently serving as the interim director of Syracuse's Middle Eastern Studies program. Dr. Khalil is the author of America's Dream Palace, Middle East Expertise and the Rise of the National Security State. That was published by Harvard University Press in 2016, and which was named by Foreign Affairs as a best book of 2017. I have my copy here, and I would urge all of you to get one on Amazon. It's an amazing read, although a little bit dense, but anyway, so thank you, gentlemen, for being here, and thank you so much for coming. So I will just sort of start off, in very broad terms, and sort of ask you, and perhaps I can ask you, Osama, first, since you've traveled a great distance. How would you characterize the Trump administration general foreign policy approach towards the Middle East and the broader Muslim world? And what are some of the trends that you have seen over the past year? And what are current US interests in the region?
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be here with David, who has a great reputation. We've never actually met before, but David is well known in the field. So I'm happy to be here. And those are a couple of different questions. So I want to kind of separate
There were 3 questions in one, but that's
but thank you again for the invite. So I think, why don't we start with the kind of the broader question, kind of what are U.S. interests in the Middle East, because those are fairly consistent, really, in the post-war period, the post-World War II period. And often, I'm assuming, let me ask this question. How many of you watch the Sunday morning talk shows, what are left of them? Face the Nation. Really? Wow. So when I ask my students that, I'm not surprised. I'm really surprised by the other stuff.
How many of us are listening to NPR?
Okay. How many are listening to NPR in the morning? Okay. All right. So, sorry.
proud of it.
Good. Just to get the audience. Thank you. So, if you hear a standard kind of official from the State Department, what they will tell you is U.S. interests in the Middle East really come down to several things. One is, quote-unquote, security and stability in the region, support for the State of Israel, and the free flow of oil. Often juxtapose that with kind of fighting radicalism or terrorism, right? So these are kind of standard approaches that cover the past 60 to 70 years. Those are all often defined by American interests, right? This has very little to do with what the people on the ground think, right? And often relationships between the United States and local allies and the governments, which are often far less popular to their populations than we would like to admit here, and definitely far less popular than policymakers would like to admit. So if you look at it from that lens, there hasn't been much difference from Trump to prior administrations. There's been a rhetorical difference, right? The one major difference, and we can come on that, but some of that dips into domestic policy, is of course the travel ban, right? But even that was a very specific focused at several countries. It is, and again, a rhetorical aspect. The fact that it was not carried through or has been blocked by the courts is one positive. There is some consistency to the Obama administration. There are several different consistencies between Obama and Trump, particularly in places like Yemen, particularly towards Iran. So there is a lot more consistency, at least in the past several administrations, that I think many in the room may be comfortable with, or that even those of us who focus on U.S. foreign policy are willing to admit, and it actually has been fairly consistent. I'll stop there and I'll leave it to turn over to David.
Thanks, Osama. I'm also delighted to to meet you, and I actually read the book yesterday, and it's wonderful, so I recommend it. And thank you, Mehlaka. It's always nice to be here, and it's nice to see some familiar faces that I haven't seen for a while. I'm particularly delighted to see a lot of high school students, including, I guess, a fair number of people from Amherst Regional High School, where my daughter is a 10th grader and has been complaining that she's heard my name in a loudspeaker the last couple of days. So at least we can put an end to that now that we're here, and I'm glad you guys are here. And in line with having younger folks here, I guess I'm going to use 5 words. I don't know if they're SAT words, but 5 multisyllabic words to describe the Trump administration's foreign policy approach to the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. And those words would be arrogant, under-equipped, episodic, deferential, and anti-democratic. And I'm going to explain them very briefly. So arrogant, because Trump and his inner circle definitely think that they know best. They're not interested in perspectives contrary to their own. I think that that's become very clear. Under-equipped, because the Trump administration has cut a lot of positions in the Department of State, and many of the people working in the administration don't have a lot of diplomatic expertise. So it seems as if what we're seeing is a foreign policy that is being built mostly on the threat or possible use of force. Episodic I used as my third word because the lack of foreign affairs personnel that I just mentioned and Trump's own sort of short attention span mean that there really isn't a lot of consistency or follow-through in some foreign policy initiatives. The fourth word I used was deferential, and what I mean by that is deferential towards other leaders, particularly authoritarian leaders. The Trump administration seems to listen to a lot of select foreign leaders, particularly Vladimir Putin and the leaders of Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So there's a lot of sort of listening to what other people think foreign policy should be in the region. And finally, anti-democratic, because Trump and his aides have shown little appreciation of civil rights, political dissent, and other democratic values, either here in the U.S., as we know, or in other countries. In terms of U.S. interests in the region, the question was actually not necessarily what they see as U.S. interests. So, I think that U.S. interests in the regions might be less conflict, working for less conflict, a relief of the humanitarian nightmares of Syria, Yemen, and the Gaza, and the actual effort to sort of connect in some way American values to reduce conflict and adversity. Now, of course, the Trump administration doesn't see any of these things as U.S. interests, and it seems like doing less in general, closing our own borders as much as possible to Muslims and Middle Easterners, perhaps other than some that Trump likes, and going after a particular set of threats, namely ISIS and Iran, are the current U.S. priorities.
If I could.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I agree with a lot of what David said there. What I want to just caution is that that's not very different from the George W. Bush administration. And it's not very, especially the arrogance part. I think we're all very familiar. What I think the major difference, David is absolutely right in that one of the things the administration has done is so many ambassador posts are unfilled. A number of the mid to lower level, the lower level posts are filled, but the mid-range posts at state are not, all right? So they're really running this effectively on the cheap or really with very little care for filling many of these positions. But in terms of the arrogance, in terms of the deferring to dictators, especially those in the region, this is completely standard, right? I mean, this is exactly what George W. Bush did. In spite of the rhetoric, this is also what Barack Obama did. And I think we have to be honest about that. So, for example, one of the points I'll bring, it may come up later, is this. Before Obama left office, in the last year, maybe 6 months or so, one of the things dating back to the Carter administration, and many of you in the room will know this, is that the State Department compiles a human rights report. And so what's supposed to happen is those governments that have a bad record of human rights are not supposed to get weapons. right? Or have to report on the use of those weapons against civilians. The Obama administration decided to strip that from Egypt. So that's been canceled. That was canceled under Obama. It was not canceled under Trump. It was canceled under Barack Obama. The same thing for the Saudis. So we have to also start being really honest, I think, about Barack Obama's record here and what he has turned over. He inherited from Bush, and then what they've both turned over to the Trump administration, which is quite frightening.
Thank you. David, would you like to respond, or are you okay?
Well, if you ask the next question.
Okay, I'll ask the next question.
Connect to that.
Okay, great. So you talked about the State Department being gutted, and that's we've been seeing that happening progressively. But then also in terms of the administration itself and the top level positions, there's been a lot of reshuffling around that. And of course, we just a couple of weeks ago saw the replacement of Rex Tillerson with Mike Pompeo. And Mike Pompeo, who's the former head of the CIA, has been very overt, almost like our president, in terms of sort of speaking very explicitly about his anti-Muslim sentiments, and has very and has come out and is quite unapologetically very sort of operates within the clash of civilizations framework when it comes to American Muslims and also just the Muslim world in general and his sort of perception of that. So going forward, and sort of given how close Pompeo is with Trump, how do you see foreign policy in the Middle East being shaped by some of that clash of civilizations lens, or do you see geopolitical considerations being the main drivers of policy? Who would like to?
So actually, I actually do want to go back for a second with only a very slight counterpoint to your counterpoint on the sort of, how is the current administration's foreign policy generally similar or different from things that they've done in the past. And I agree. I think, I didn't say anything about Obama, of course. I just was talking about Trump. I think it is 100% central to kind of look at continuity. And so I would say also that there's been a lot of similarity with Trump and things we've seen in the past. And in very basic terms, much of U.S. foreign policy since World War II has been to try to be the strongest military and economic power in the world, with the idea that other countries will then defer, to U.S. power. And that policy, even though it's sort of not really the same time period we're talking about, kind of gets summed up by the old famous statement of Theodore Roosevelt: "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And to the extent that there's really a major update that Trump has made, it's more like tweet loudly and brag about having a big stick. But essentially, what I do think is different, if you like, is that this kind of basic policy of trying to be the most powerful country has been supplemented by an idea that championing rules that are good for other countries and that project values of freedom and self-determination, however imperfectly this is done, actually can help with cooperation. This is what people call foreign policy liberalism. And again, it doesn't have anything to do with liberalism that we talk about it in the media. And as much as that piece may never have been the dominant piece or is realized imperfectly, particularly when it comes to actually pushing for democratic values in other countries, what I think is different about the Trump administration is that there's no pretense of holding on to that. I think we saw this very early, that Trump doesn't care about rules, doesn't either understand or care to understand that if you play a certain way with other countries might play the same way with you. So I personally, again, we can have it's very important to have a debate. And I think, we may have shades of difference about how much the sort of obeying law and being concerned about values piece of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East really means much. But the fact that it's now altogether abandoned, I think means the U.S. then has to work that much harder to kind of maximize power. And that, I think, does give it a disadvantage in whatever foreign policy goals it might have. And then onto the other question, I honestly at this point don't know what to say about Pompeo and what he's going to mean. Clearly, He has a record of being driven in part by suspicion towards Islam, or certainly Islamist politics in the Middle East, and that's true for Trump as well. And it's also true that Americans who are suspicious of Islam and who don't like, Islamist politics are among his core supporters. So, that matters. But in practice, Trump is pretty selective about which Muslims and Muslim countries arouse his suspicions. I mean, usually the people that arouse his suspicions are refugees, victims of violence, and also violent movements themselves. So I would assume that under, the reshuffled cabinet, Iran and anti-state Muslim movements will continue and be ramped up as the boogeyman, and not necessarily Muslims in the region more generally. But my real concern around, Trump's lack of knowledge of world affairs, the cuts in diplomatic staffing at the State Department, is that this administration seems unusually susceptible to being urged by other countries to take positions that may not be actually that useful to the U.S. And I think this happens a lot. We see this in the way that buzzwords that matter to Trump are very imprecise. So, like extremism, for example, is a word that, as far as I know, after decades of studying the Arab world, has no meaning no real meaning. But whenever Trump believes there's extremism, he could well kind of respond favorably towards a policy designed to defeat it. And I think that this, so for example, vague assurances from Saudi Arabia to Trump and to his son-in-law Jared Kushner that the small Gulf country Qatar was funding extremism, I think really did help lead to the White House's initial support for a Saudi-Emirati move to cut off ties to Qatar. But Qatar is a key U.S. ally in the region, and there's no particular reason that the U.S. should take that position. And indeed, a big schism among Gulf countries, Arab Gulf countries, is not good for the U.S. or broader regional stability. So this is the kind of thing I think we might see under this administration. It's a little different.
So I'll kind of give the flip side of the Qatar relationship, which is, I think one of the things that's most troubling about the administration is, of course, this full-on embrace of Islamophobes. Right? So you're seeing that not just with the new Secretary of State or the Secretary of State designee, but also Bolton being tapped as National Security Advisor. That is a troubling trend, right? And it's also those like Frank Gaffney, Bridget Gabriel, some of the other groups, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. How many of you have heard of FDD? Anybody? Okay. So FDD is a far-right think tank with strong ties to the Likud party and Benjamin Netanyahu. They were basically dismissed for a long time in Washington, and they have basically a front row seat with the Trump administration. So Heritage is out, AEI is out, the old neocon think tanks don't have as much say. The ones that had say with both Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, or George W. Bush. Now you have FDD and some others who are even further to the right and fully embrace Islamophobia. So that's an issue. I will add that one of the things I think we can probably see, and then I'm going to kind of disagree with myself for a second. One of the things I think we can probably see is greater tension with Iran. Right? That seems to be where the administration is headed. He seems to be hinting, the president seems to be hinting on Twitter that he's going to cancel the nuclear agreement with Iran. He is unlikely to get the European powers that signed on to this to agree with him, which means that the sanctions regime that the U.S. had in place is unlikely to hold, and it really does not give Iran a reason not to continue on with its nuclear program, right? And if it decides not to, it's only because it wants to maintain relations with the European states, which will now at this point be broken away from the United States. That is also, this confrontation with Iran, in spite of the nuclear agreement, is also consistent with the previous administration. Even with the sources of tension with Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf states, one of the things that they were in agreement on was containing Iran's influence. Right? The other thing I think you want to think about is why was Qatar being targeted? Qatar had recently announced it was opening up a shared massive natural gas field with Iran following the nuclear agreement. This is one of the things that the Saudis really objected to, and it actually included a major deal that was cut with a French energy company. So there are a couple of layers to this that were making the Saudis very uncomfortable, and you can assume Washington. So I think there's a couple of things that we need to remember, that there are some consistencies here, right? And I agree with my colleague that it's not necessarily a full-on continuity, but there's enough there to be troubling. The one thing I will throw out is this. The president is very much, from what we can tell from the reports, is driven by loyalty, right? He wants his advisors to be loyal to him above all else. He seems to favor the Secretary of Defense, Mattis. If there is hope, it's that Mattis, whose nickname is Mad Dog, so I'll leave it at that. If there's hope, the guy named Mad Dog is the one who's supposed to keep Bolton's finger off the button. So.
Well, thank you for that. So I think we'll shift gears a little bit and sort of hone in on specific countries. And of course, this is not going to be an exhaustive list of questions. We're hoping that the audience will then fill in with their own set of questions. So, but speaking of Saudi Arabia, right now we have MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, on a 3-week tour to the United States, and it's being dubbed as his charm offensive, trying to get more investment from U.S. companies, and is also trying to sort of liberalize Saudi Arabia internally, culturally, by giving women the right to vote and sort of advancing the rights of minority groups as well. And of course, we've seen, I think he's 32 perhaps, and Jared Kushner is maybe 31 or something, or very close to that. So they have struck up a wonderful friendship. And of course, there's this cozying up of relations with Saudi Arabia, while the Obama administration had sort of kept that regime at an arm's length and tried to sort of balance between Iran and Saudi Arabia somewhat. And so what is this going to, how is that going to impact stability in the region going forward? And how is it stabilizing and how is it destabilizing for the region?
Yeah, so on an off-topic, lighter note, I feel like I've been looking to see breakthroughs in Jewish-Arab relations for as long as I can remember, and now we have the beautiful friendship between Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman. So it's like what I've been wanting for much of my life is coming to pass. Again, I think the point that the point that I'm trying to make, or I tried to make before, is that what seems strange and unusual, slightly strange and unusual here, is that the combination of Trump and his loyalists' sort of disdain for diplomacy, disdain for expertise, hubris, and just kind of tendency to love authoritarians really makes it easy for countries, and I think that this is certainly true with Saudi Arabia, to manipulate U.S. foreign policy slightly more than they've been able to do in the past. And again, I think it's very important that over the last many decades, the main nexus of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has been, with Israel and Saudi Arabia, and depending on what's going on with Egypt. So none of that's changing. But what is changing is that the way that Saudi Arabia and MBS is in this very assertive sort of, if you like, quest for greater regional dominance and influence, which also, as I think Osama noted, also helps explain why the Saudis went after Qatar. At this moment of expanding Saudi power, it's dangerous to have a kind of a United States government that maybe, as I know there's a lot of Jewish colleagues in the audience, to go back to the Passover Haggadah maybe doesn't know what questions to ask. I think, again, that one of the hot issues that we all should care about is the Saudi the Saudi war in Yemen, which is being waged with, through weapons that our tax dollars have paid for and continue to pay for, or are benefiting the U.S. economy, and really, what looks to be true is that the U.S. is very involved in support for this war, but is sort of deferring to the Saudis and MBS about what the war means, and taking a little bit at face value that what is actually a very complicated local conflict that has not gone well for the Saudis at all is an important and necessary step towards containing Iran. So I think that the Saudi, again, I'm not trying to pick on Saudi Arabia in particular, but I think that it is a good example of the way in which, as much as U.S. foreign policy specialists have used the slightly demeaning sort of term that that countries that are sort of client states of the U.S. are, the tails that wag the dog. I mean, this is really a situation that's slightly different, and I think should be more troubling in the extent to which, the U.S. is sort of pulling back and letting allies make policy, call the shots, in a way that may be useful, as a general principle, but also doesn't necessarily serve, U.S. values or interests.
Can we have a timeout
Yes.
for a second and just try to deal with this
Of
feedback
course.
thing, because it's very hard to pay
Absolutely,
attention.
yes. So let's try and figure out, I don't know whether it's our speakers or whether the source is that.
I actually think it's outside. I don't think it's coming from that box. I think it's outside.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Or it might be the vacuum upstairs even.
Yeah, maybe we can ask the gentleman who helped us set up, perhaps they'd be able to. Sorry, everyone.
Yeah, I think we're being jammed by Sinclair Broadcast.
I think that's it.
Oh, yeah.
I think it starts off.
I'm gonna go find out what it is. Yeah, it's about
Oh, it's from up there. Thank you so much.
vacuum.
Yeah, it seems like this kind of sounds like.
I know, it started into the thing.
Yeah, it didn't start at the beginning.
It didn't start at the beginning. So should we continue and hopefully it should be
Yes.
addressed?
Yeah, somebody's working on it.
Yes, as long as it's not us, so. Yes. No.
So I would just, in terms of
I think we're
the,
going to get back to the conversation.
so I kind of want to disagree with the premise of the question and then connect that. I think there's often a fundamental misunderstanding about U.S.-Saudi relations and the role of Saudi Arabia, that one, that Saudi Arabia plays in not only in the global economy, but plays for the United States. So really in the post-war, really since the end of World War II, but really since the 1970s and the 1973 oil crisis, Saudi Arabia plays a key role as the pivot producer of oil, all right? And they're looking for a pivot producer of oil. In other words, they can open up the spigot or they can close it to maintain, that's how big their oil reserves are, to maintain a certain price of oil, all right? And what they try to find is this steady rate that, one, benefits the global economy, in particular the U.S. economy, but also enough to fund their own extravagant lifestyle, okay? Particularly of the royal family. The other thing that the Saudis do with that fund, with those funds, is to recycle petrodollars, either through massive purchases of military equipment, far beyond what they can use ever, right? And two, investments in the U.S., as well as Europe. So this includes real estate, it includes major corporations, variety of different investments that the Saudis make. So there is a real confluence of interest here between Saudi Arabia and the United States. In terms of the war in Yemen, so what I would disagree is that during the Obama administration that there was this split between the United States and Saudi Arabia. In fact, there was far more agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia, including on Syria, right, and on Yemen. So in fact, the war in Yemen from the beginning, the Obama administration was in on, all right? What they disagreed on, so that we should be clear, that is a 4-year-old war that goes back to the Obama administration. And from the beginning, the Obama administration and Saudi Arabia were on the same page in Syria, right? So, for example, we talked about Qatar a little bit. The foreign minister of Qatar the former foreign minister, gave an interview on in Arabic on one of the local channels back over the summer in the middle of the fight, when the fight first started with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and UAE, and admitted that they had been coordinated with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the United States, and the UAE in Syria. And he literally said, we were handed the Syria file by Saudi Arabia. So they were supposed to be managing the quote-unquote funding of the opposition in Syria. And that they coordinated with all the different players. So this is something that there was not like this idea that we had that the Obama administration wasn't doing anything in Syria. They were doing a lot in Syria. It just didn't work. They were often working at cross purposes, which is a whole other issue. The one place where they disagreed was on Iran and on the nuclear deal. Right? And there are some who would argue, whether it's true or not, although I think it's probably not true, that the Yemen war was kind of a tip to Saudi Arabia in return for the nuclear deal. That's quite a trade-off. So Saudi Arabia's been bombing Yemen for 4 years with support from the UAE, with support from others. So here you have two of the richest countries, not just in the region, but in the world, bombing and starving one of the poorest countries in the region, if not the world. The important thing to remember there is that they're trying, quote-unquote, to contain Iran. All right? The other thing where the United States and Iran, quote-unquote, agreed was on ISIS. Right? And so this was the use of Shia-led militias trained by the Iranians or coordinating with the Iranians to fight against ISIS. There's another way to view that, which is the same way you could view the Iran-Iraq war, for those who remember back in the 80s, which is let them bleed each other white. It's better for them to be fighting than for us to be sending special forces on the fight. Right? So I think we have to understand that this relationship, like any relationship, has its ups and downs and has several different components to it. But the one thing the Saudis have been absolutely consistent on, and this included with bin Salman's recent visit, is they are very happy to purchase massive quantities of weapons from the United States, and they do not have the forces to use them. So one question is, why do they keep basically running a jobs program for the United States? Right, and that's essentially what they're doing. Right? So in fact, bin Salman agreed to, basically with Lockheed, I think it is, to build a whole new navy, right, for Saudi Arabia. Right? So this is, and of course picking out new fighters, etc. This goes back, by the way, well back into the 1970s, right? When you really start to see Saudi Arabia building up. Some of you may remember, and I think when we look at like a real example for Trump, those in the room who remember Richard Nixon, right? And the crazy Nixon idea, right? So Nixon, how was Nixon going to end the war in Vietnam? With the crazy Nixon approach, right? He was going to threaten war with the Soviet Union. He was going to threaten to use nuclear weapons in North Vietnam, etc., etc. None of which worked. So here we have someone who has some of Nixon's former advisors, like Roger Stone, who are kind of giving this idea that if you behave like a madman, and if you act like a madman on Twitter, you'll scare the world and they'll do your bidding. Right? Nixon believed that too, for about 5 minutes. And then he actually came down to reality and actually had to do some of the hard work. Right? So I think when we look at this, there are several different components to it, but I think we shouldn't underestimate how deep this relationship is between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And even though there have been points of, for instance, conflict, at the very least, it is a key pillar of U.S. foreign policy in the region, and has been for some time.
And speaking of which, I mean, how will that impact Saudi Arabia's relationship with Israel? How has the Trump administration's sort of unilateral decision on the Jerusalem question, how will that impact the future of Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations? And what do you think the policy will be going forward on this?
Yeah, it's funny because the very first article I published in graduate school was, and this was in the 80s, was about Saudi-American relations, in which I argued, of course, because it was very easy to argue that this is an enduring relationship that's very complex and it's going to continue for decades and decades and decades. Of course, it was a very safe bet and a not particularly controversial argument, but here we are, and it's intensified. So the Jerusalem decision is certainly a big poke in the eye to Palestinians and to anybody in the Arab world or elsewhere that supports Palestinian rights and the possibility of a Palestinian state. It's absolutely angered most Palestinians and raised tempers pretty high against the U.S. and Israel. And there's a kind of standard analysis that that Trump kind of made this move and there was no real reason for it, didn't get anything for it. But I see it personally as a sort of gesture that makes worse a situation that's really quite awful in terms of Palestinian-Israeli prospects for a settlement, rather than being a game changer. And I think this does go back to Saudi Arabia. What we're seeing, and maybe some of you read the interview that Jeffrey Goldberg, the Atlantic editor, had yesterday with Mohammed bin Salman. But I think what we're seeing is clearly greater cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel. I mean, it's not that there hasn't been a lot of behind the scenes and even a little less than behind the scenes interaction between the two, but I think with the Trump administration both more likely to believe what the Saudi government says as opposed to just being good friends with it, and with the Trump administration so hostile to Iran, the long-standing Saudi Arabian Israeli interest in not just containing Iran, but really doing everything it can to neuter its political and military power is becoming kind of front and center a big issue in the region. And with Egypt now once again sort of pretty squarely in highly authoritarian territory in which popular feelings about Palestine or much of anything else don't matter as much as Sisi's ability to get massive construction money from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. What you have basically is Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel working pretty hard together on a kind of longer term, regional security / economic alliance that really is putting, Palestinian and the Palestinian issue to the back. I just actually had a basic piece in the conversation on this last week. I don't know. I'm not convinced that the Trump administration is going to be able to sort of make it, whatever peace plan it eventually comes out with, stick. But as a lot of people have analyzed over the years, on the Israeli side certainly, and to some extent on the Palestinian side, there's lots of incentives for the issue to remain unsettled. And at this point, Saudi Arabia is just looking for some reason to be more upfront about cooperating with Israel in a kind of broader regional security anti-Iranian front.
Right. In response to that question, could you also talk some about the response of the Arab world to this question, or to the unilateral declaration by the United States as well, because there's been mixed responses to that as well.
Right. So listen. I'm going to try and be a little controversial tonight. So wake everybody up a little bit. So the first one is I wrote a little bit of something on this for Al Jazeera. I don't see this as this major split by the U.S. I actually see this as the culmination of 70 years of U.S. policy towards the Palestinians. All right. So to put that in perspective, you can kind of basically divide up U.S. policy towards the Palestinians in kind of three buckets. So for about the first 20 or so years, the United States ignored the Palestinian problem, right? Viewed it as a humanitarian issue, not a political issue, just sought to deal with the Arab states. Then for about the next 25 years, what the United States did after the PLO came under the leadership of Palestinians rather than beholden to Nasser and Egypt, was it sought to undermine the PLO and not engage with the PLO at all. And then really after 1993, what it's done is co-opt the PLO and the leadership of the Palestinians. So what the Trump decision actually does is it finally kind of exposes the Palestinian leadership, particularly Arafat's decision in 1998 and 1993 with Oslo, and then Abbas's decision to kind of focus only on negotiations, exposes that as a failure, right? So the reality now, the reality on the ground, is that there will be no Palestinian state, right? There will be no negotiated solution. And Benjamin Netanyahu has made this clear. So this is where I disagree with David a little bit. Netanyahu has made this clear. He's made this clear since the 90s. He has no interest in a Palestinian state. There will not be a Palestinian state under Netanyahu. So that, I know a lot of my friends and colleagues have this dream that Netanyahu, when his dad died, was somehow going to go make the big deal. There's no deal, all right? What Netanyahu said recently was the following. Even if we negotiate a deal, and it won't be for a state, it'll be for some kind of Palestinian autonomous area, all right? Ultimate sovereignty remains with Israel. So there's no Palestinian state, right? So for the high school students in the room, some of you are going to go to college soon, you're going to take IR classes, sovereignty being the basis of statehood. If Israel is the one power that holds sovereignty in between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, then there's no Palestinian state. So if the absolute minimum of what Palestinians want can't be achieved, all right, then there can't be a negotiation here. So in spite of what the president, the great deal maker, as he keeps saying he's going to make this fantastic deal, aspects of that deal have already leaked out, and it's not even close to the minimum of what Palestinians can accept. Or even its unelected leadership in Mahmoud Abbas, right? So let's be clear about that. Palestinian leadership is unelected, all right? Abbas has been in power for longer as an unelected official than he was when he was elected, right? Now you have another issue, which is that Israel has finally admitted recently, this was recently in Haaretz, they've been dancing around for several years now, that Palestinians are the majority, right? By about, give or take, 300,000 to 400,000, right? So, Palestinians are the majority, being led by a minority, in which there is a separate and unequal set of rules. Some of you in this room, I think, fought against apartheid in the 80s, right? So you have at least two apartheid regimes that exist today. One is in Bahrain and the other is in Israel. And I think one of the questions later is about what can people do, right? So if you fought against the apartheid in the 80s, you have a very simple choice now, right?
Okay, so we'll continue this conversation, I think, in the general Q&A, and so we're trying to wrap up this segment of our conversation, but I do have a question about Syria. There's been a lot of sort of oscillation between what's being said by President Trump and then also what his administration and his cabinet members have been saying about U.S. military presence in Syria. ISIS, by all accounts, has been considerably, weakened in its sort of presence there. What do you think American involvement will look like, and what do you think it should look like now that it seems as if the conflict seems to be sort of drawing down? Not in the short term, but at least.
And then I'll try and work in some about, you asked about where the feeling on the Arab Street. So I also think in terms of the Jerusalem decision, you want to separate the leadership, because David's right, he hit on this. Bin Salman clearly gave a nod to Netanyahu and Trump that Jerusalem was off the table, right? The same thing from the UAE. They've been very willing, and Sisi, to abandon Jerusalem in spite of the public rhetoric. How populations feel is a different story. At the same time, they also recognize that Israel has actually changed the demographics and the geography of Jerusalem since 1967. So there's a lot more to unpack there. In terms of Syria, I think somebody asked at the beginning, there are several different policies towards Syria right now, right? And there are several different Syrias. So there's the Syria that's being held under regime control. There are several pockets that are still held by, you can call it the opposition, or you can call it what it actually is, right? Which is the Nusra Front and elements of ISIS, all right? Whatever was left of the Free Syrian Army is now in exile, okay? And that's mostly in the Idlib pocket. And then you have certain areas that are controlled by several other groups, including the United States. You have the Turks, which have intervened against Kurds. So Syria has there are several different Syrias at the moment. The United States says it's staying in part to wipe up remnants of ISIS. That may be the case. It may not be the case. They may be holding a staging ground for future operations. That much is unclear. And apparently, as we talked a little bit about this before, the administration is already walking back, at least publicly, in response to the Pentagon, some of what the president said on Twitter about Syria. I think for the short term, it's pretty clear that the regime has won, right? There's going to be a lot more bloodletting over the next year or two until this is finally resolved. Whether they will probably, it's unlikely that they'll be able to control all of the former territory of Syria, but they'll control the majority of the population, and that's enough for them. And then they can always point to these areas like in and around Idlib if they don't want to expend the price of an invasion as this is where the terrorists are. And that adds into the regime's narrative, which is what they've been saying for several years now. I think there's some questions later about what can people do, and I think we can talk more about some ideas. But it seems unlikely to me that the United States is going to intervene in a large way into Syria to overthrow the regime. There doesn't seem much stomach for it, either in the administration or even in the American public. So the one warning sign I will say is this, is that if there was a boost in Trump's popularity, it was after his launching of cruise missiles at Syria, at the airfields. And in fact, even on MSNBC, Brian Williams was practically in ecstasy at the sight of Tomahawk missiles being fired from a ship. So, this is a president who likes distraction. This is a president who likes to have a bit of the carnival barker in him, right? And he does it often around dipping poll numbers, bad news about the elections, the 2018 elections, or any kind of special election, or about the Russia investigation. So if there is kind of a warning sign, it's that you have a president who, really the reality star comes out and says, don't look over there, look at this. And because he's been rewarded with it before, he may do it again.
Yes, I pretty much agree with everything Osama just said, and I would add, sort of repeating what I've been sort of consistently saying, that but my additional fear with this particular administration is always that someone, maybe the Saudis, maybe Bolton, will convince Trump, using a vague term like extremism, or reminding him that there are remnants of ISIS, to do something exactly along the lines that we're talking about. I mean, it's a very funny thing with Trump that, and I don't think it's that contradictory. That on the one hand, he does really threaten the use of military force all the time, and on the other hand, he hasn't yet committed to doing so other than the Syria strike, and there's lots of reasons to think that he might not. And I think it's just, I think that there, obviously the contradiction was resolved exactly because he likes this sort of unpredictability. He thinks it makes him look strong. But there really is unpredictability in him and what his people and what his allies will tell him. And so I would presume that as long as an argument is made that extremists or ISIS continue to be a problem in Syria, that there will be some U.S. military presence, and that's always a very slippery sort of argument to, for somebody who's not following this in great deal to really concretize.
Great, so the last question for this part of our conversation is, well, what can people do to be more involved when it comes to U.S. foreign policy? What can we as citizens do more in terms of advocacy, and holding our representatives accountable in terms of what they're doing, or what the U.S. government is doing in different parts of the Muslim world?
Well, so I think, you want to, I would separate that into several different aspects. I think, and we were talking before, I think there are several groups locally that work with refugees, including refugees from Syria, refugees from Iraq. I think there's things you can emphasize in terms of humanitarian action, both for resettlement here, helping with education here, as well as helping with the very large refugee population overseas, in terms of the many different needs that they may need. Many of those UN programs targeting refugees are heavily underfunded, right? So, for example, if you recall when Obama drew his line in the sand in 2013 and wanted to do a strike on Syria, the cost of that strike was going to be far more than the UNHCR campaign for Syrian refugees, right? And yet, even at that time, at the height of the Syrian crisis, the UNHCR campaign was at 30 to 40% underfunded, right? Or 30 to 40% of funding, rather. So I think there's a dramatic need that needs to be met, particularly on the humanitarian side. If you are interested in peace in Israel-Palestine, I think there's really one of the major groups you can join. The U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, Jewish Voices for Peace is another major group. For those of you who are college students or about to go to college, Students for Justice in Palestine, these are all groups that you can work on or work with to achieve peace, if you really want to achieve peace in Israel-Palestine. If you're focused on negotiations, good luck, it's not going to happen. In terms of on the broader Muslim world and what you can do for activism, right? Now, I think there are several different groups you can work with here in the U.S. There's CARE is another major one. But you should also, as we start to separate, the same way we look at domestic politics in the U.S., you can look at foreign policy, right? So look for candidates and support candidates, whether for national office or even at the state level, who support reasonable, rational policies, right? We often ignore that Clinton had a very interventionist approach to foreign policy, right? Now, much of that was papered over because she was running against Trump. But let's not ignore what she was arguing for and who embraced her, right? Including many of the neoconservatives who were behind the war in Iraq, who wouldn't touch Trump, right? Now, we can look at certain Senate candidates, we can look at candidates for governor, and those are the people who, especially since Citizens United, with the major funders and the major donors who are able to hide the amounts of money that they're able to give the candidates. So it's important that at grassroots level that you help with candidates and give not only money but time to support them if you think they support a reasonable, rational foreign policy. Right? I think the last thing I'll say is this. Many of you, some I think are teachers in the room, some of you with your other jobs, look at your IRAs or your 401k plans, right, your retirement plans, and make sure that they're not invested in military contractors. If you want to impact foreign policy, don't invest in military contractors, right? There's only one way they make money, right? It's when their weapons are used, right?
Yeah, so I agree with all of that. I'll add a couple things. I mean, first of all, the truth is that if you really want to influence U.S. policy, you should find a way to be a guest on Fox and Friends. I mean, that is how you could do it. Flatter Trump and then say something smart about, what U.S. policy should be. That's it. But I think, apart from that, I very much want to echo, I think, the subtext of what Osama said, which is that this is sort of a medium run to long-term game. I mean, especially for, those of us in the room who are older, this is a particularly distressing moment to see really the abandonment of any pretense in U.S. foreign policy around caring about other people. And again, I mean, almost any decent Middle Eastern specialist will want to be clear that much of the time that the U.S. talks about democracy and human rights, there's hypocrisy. The continuities are, between or among administrations are very strong. I mean, it's not. I certainly, haven't particularly said that Obama was some kind of a golden era in a humane or even coherent Middle Eastern, foreign policy. But the pretense is gone now, and it's very hard for those of us who care about people dying, needlessly in conflicts in the Arab world or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, to sort of feel like there's much obvious in the short run that's going to kind of turn policy. But all of the things that Osama suggested are also part of a strategy. And again, I mean, this is one of the reasons I feel very fortunate to be able to live where I live. Are part of a strategy of using, ethical commitments, using people's faith and values as a way of really, trying to be consistent and chip away at the kind of broader cynical and, if you like, inhumane discourse that seems so dominant at the moment. I mean, it's not just that, welcoming refugees or, giving flowers to a Muslim on, what is it, hate him?
Punish a
Muslim Day. I mean, it's not just that act in and of itself, is important and countering. It's part of creating a national public narrative that there's a lot of people that actually believe in a very different sort of value set than the current administration embraces. So I think that's all it's slightly flowery, but I mean I think that it's I struggle with this all the time. I mean I don't think there's a whole lot that I can do, and even my colleagues who are better placed to do things don't think there's a lot they can do to sort of help the Syrian political situation immediately. But we sure as hell can advocate around what a better refugee system would look like, or what we as Americans who are part of this Iraq war, I mean, whether we want it to be or not, have to think about in terms of responsibility for what's there. And that does lead me to two somewhat practical points. I mean, I think, I agree about working for candidates, but I really want to be blunt about this. I mean, I think, this is about trying to get more progressive candidates in Congress, period. I mean, because the second piece of this is that there are concrete issues where it might be possible to push the political, to actually push policy that have to do with really making the United States or people who work in the government feel some sense of responsibility for their complicity. So, I mean, again, my expertise is not particularly on Yemen or the Yemen war, but my friends who are working on this do feel pretty confident that consistent pressure on Congress around, arms sales or accountability for what's happening with arms sales that might be used against Yemenis, especially if we can change some of the congressional seats, could make a difference. The United States does, I think there are even Republicans that I think really understand that the Iraq war, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein created a certain sort of responsibility that both the Democratic and Republican administrations alike have in their fumbling, multifaceted way, I think understood matters. So, Iraq is a really important site of humanitarian challenge, and there was this sort of triumphalist article that I saw about how Iraq is finally looking more democratic. I mean, it was an interesting and somewhat bemusing read to me, but I mean, it is, I suppose, true that the country has gone through several peaceful government transitions, and it certainly is a responsibility that whether or not we supported the war, which many of us didn't, have to bear on our shoulders. So there are issues like this that I think we can actually get leverage. Although, again, I think this has got to be we have to gear up. It's a kind of a longer term, live our values, speak our values, and those values ultimately, I think, are critical.
So I'm going to ask you to be sure when you raise a question that you're actually raising a question. Obviously there won't be a hook, but do think that over. And you feel free to ask either one of our presenters or Melika, or ask them both. And I think you guys will work, no. You might have
I'm not
something
the
to say.
expert here, obviously.
But either or both may jump in no matter what you say, and we welcome all of those questions and all of those answers. So is anyone ready to start? Yes.
I have a question for
Here, let me come a
Osama.
little bit towards you so that the recording picks you up. Or will you come toward me? We want you to be on the TV piece, which you won't be if you don't come to a mic. This cord is longer than.
I just wondered when you made the comment about Israel being a apartheid state, were you referring to the Palestinian occupied territories, or were you referring to the state of Israel?
good clarification.
Okay, so this works at several levels, right? So Palestinian citizens of Israel don't have equal rights. That's well documented. I'm sorry. Palestinian citizens of Israel don't have equal rights. Right? So you have a separate but unequal system for Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's not a mystery. It's well documented. It's been well documented for years. Right? So you have a gradation of rights. Okay, so Palestinian citizens of Israel have more rights than Palestinians who live in Jerusalem. Right? And they have more rights than Palestinians who live in the occupied territories, who effectively have no rights. Okay, so when you have a separate but unequal system of okay, which we had here in the United States during the Jim Crow years, which apartheid South Africa had, which you have a deliberate system, right, of minority rule and imposed on a majority, which we're now seeing, right? It's clearly a majority, and it's discriminatory, and particularly when the majority of that group have no rights at all, as was seen, quite frankly, this weekend, right? You can't protest without being shot dead, right, in Gaza. Okay, this is just the most recent example of it. Right? So unarmed protesters being shot in the street. If it didn't remind people of Sharpeville, right? So I think this is all very well documented. By the way, this actually shouldn't be controversial. Secretary of State John Kerry said it. Former Prime Minister Ehud Barak said it. Ehud Olmert said it. That if Israel does not make peace, they've said this several times, we will become an apartheid state. That day's here. Right? We can pretend, we can kick the can down the road another 5 years because it'll make us more comfortable. But the reality's here. Okay? So I think we have to start unpacking what does Israel's differing systems of rule mean for Palestinians. Right? So Palestinians inside Israel, if you go to a mixed city like Lod, how many people have been to Israel? Okay. So how many went to a mixed city like Lod? Okay.
Like which one?
Lod. Right? Okay. So Lod is a quote-unquote mixed city, right? And you have areas of Lod which are predominantly Palestinian, right? In which often resemble, or could be seen to resemble, some of the tougher neighborhoods here in the U.S., right? Areas of Boston, Newark. I'm from New Jersey originally. Right, Camden.
Where is Lod?
This is right near Jerusalem, right? So, one of the things that you're, and those are full citizens of Israel, right? But as you know, they can't serve in the army, and service in the army is your main route in Israel to all sets of privileges, including education, as well as, and the discrimination that goes on within education, but also into high-tech jobs, government sector, the national security sector, which is the main thing. So they're already discriminating against there. Now if you go into Jerusalem itself, right, which they have more rights than Palestinians live in the occupied territories, Jerusalem itself being occupied, but this is deliberate, the fact that they have more rights, right? And they're heavily discriminated against, including things like building permits, right? Including the core, I mean, if you go back to Brown versus Board of Education in the US, what was the key decision? Separate but unequal. Why? About education. The claim was, right, that we have two separate sets of schools. They are separate, but they are equal. All right? And the Supreme Court said they're not. You've had this in Israel for decades. And then if you go to the occupied territories, the disparity is even sharper, and it is deliberate. So this is well documented by human rights groups. It's well documented by the Israeli government. They don't hide it, right? They know what, in fact, when they were doing direct occupation, they used to produce reports about how much they funded and what the actual outcomes were in education and health, etc. Right? They no longer have to do that. They have the Palestinian Authority to do that for them. So, I think there has to be, once you start to strip away, and I know it's difficult, probably especially difficult for a number of people in the room, but if you look at those human rights reports, including Human Rights Watch this weekend, from the massacre, quite frankly, in Gaza, all right? It becomes very hard not to see this for what it is. John Kerry saw it. Hillary Clinton even saw it, but wouldn't say it on the record. Right?
How do you know?
Because reporters reported on it. Right? So, this is when she was Secretary of State. Hillary Clinton saw it. So they've all seen it. And if you've ever gone into the occupied Palestinian territories, if you've gone to Bethlehem, if you've seen the wall, if you've seen the matrix of checkpoints, by the way, all you have to pull those of you, everybody has internet access. Take out your phone if you want. You can type up the International Criminal Court, the ICJ rather. It's 2000 report on the wall and on Israel's occupation. This is well documented. This is not, and it's 14 years old. It's not a mystery. Right? I'm sorry, it's not, this is the most documented occupation. It's the longest running occupation, 50 years, 50 plus now. It's well documented. I mean, it's either we wake up or we don't, right? But Trump has woken it up for you. I think this is one of the things where I'm going to with David. The reality is this. We've stripped away all of the pretty rhetoric, right? We actually had a Secretary of State named Rex Tillerson, who was from Exxonmobil. All of it is stripped away. We don't have to talk about human rights anymore because, quite frankly, we don't care. Barack Obama won a Nobel Peace Prize and then launched a drone campaign on Pakistan. Okay? We can strip away all the beautiful rhetoric now, and we can start being real about what's going on. And so if you really believe in human rights, if you believe all people are equal, Palestinians are human. I'm sorry. I know that's hard for some people in the room to maybe admit, but they are.
Or do you want to take another question?
We can take more questions.
All right. Does anyone have another question? Yes.
Yeah.
Will you come forward?
Well, you touched on human rights now, and human rights reports. I would just, my question is a general one. Where does the United Nations fit into all this? I can't get a straight answer from Trump how he feels about the UN or even Nikki Haley. And how do they feel about the UN as a way of negotiation? Just want to say share an experience because I've gone to the UN. I represent an NGO there. I'll tell you, the World Jewish Congress and the World Muslim Congress, you can't tell the difference between them. The World Jewish Congress is just so liberal. They quote Hillel, Herschel, Martin Buber. They say the way the Palestinians is treated is terrible. They don't like the Israeli government very well. I'm just sharing my experience, but we don't really hear about this stuff. And the knee-jerk reaction is, well, the UN sort of started this and they're making it worse, and they can't do anything. But I question that. I still think it's a valuable way of dealing with this issue, but I just like your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm actually, I'm not quite getting, the question is a little
too general.
Yeah, it's a bit broad. I mean, but I guess what I want to say is that, again, I mean, where I think that what we're both saying the same thing in different, about different things or perhaps in different ways, is that this administration doesn't care at all about international law or international institutions. I mean, I don't think that there's any. I don't think it's a question of getting a straight answer from Trump. I mean, he doesn't care about them. He doesn't believe that law and rules ought to bind him in this country. He doesn't believe that international rules and law ought to bind him or the United States anywhere. And by elevating Bolton to National Security Advisor, I mean, he's put in place perhaps the leading figure for that position. So I don't think there's any question about where the administration stands. And, I mean, again, I think that there's a kind of a debate subtext going on among us around how significant it is when the U.S. says that it cares about things like law and values. And, I mean, I think that generally very few people who look at Middle Eastern politics will say, oh yes, the United States has consistently put to the fore a deference to international institutions or international law. But, I mean, as somebody trained as a lawyer, I do see moments in which legal arguments or the appeal to rules and institutions, as one out of a number of sort of discourses in foreign policy, do make a difference. I don't see them in this administration, and that is a difference for me. So, the United Nations on the one hand, represents the opinions and policies of a variety of countries and has standing to take action with respect to particular security situations and broader national legal questions. And on the other hand, there's a lot of problems with the institution. There's a lot of, there are a lot of ways in which the institution, because it's founded on the sovereignty of national states and because it's, founded in a system where states want to dominate, there's a lot of ways in which it's very hard for it to accomplish much. But, at a moment in which basically the leading countries in the world profess, don't just say, we care about the UN, but then go in a different direction, as, for example, the US did in many ways in the 2000s and before. But, in an era where they say, where the United States, Russia, China, essentially, I don't want to be too broad, but, essentially don't really recognize any type of potential binding authority, but, of course, do continue to want to use these institutions to advance their own agendas. It's a very, there's not much that one can expect. Even if one already has pretty low expectations. And I do want to we sort of had a discussion over dinner about the 2003 Iraq, U.S.-Iraq war, and on the one hand, this is I think this is an example of where this stuff sort of matters. On the one hand, the United States carried out a war in Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein without any reasonable legal pretext, and in a way that was, completely a violation of the one and only established criterion for war in international law, which is self-defense. So the U.S. violated international law and claimed that it was, acting under color of international law. But one of the things that happened is that it didn't get a ton of, it did what it did, but it didn't get a lot of global support. It didn't get a lot of countries that paid the war debt. And the legitimacy of what the United States did in Iraq is not, this is not a war that people look at and say, this is, a legitimate or legal conflict. And few, maybe John Bolton, but not Donald Trump, defend that war. And, again, did the UN constrain the war? No. Did the fact that this is not a place that the Security Council would, in fact, authorize this war because it violated international law, does that matter for U.S. prestige, U.S. credibility, U.S. having to hold the bag and paying the bills? I think it does. So it's not, these things matter, but we're living in a very tough anti-law authoritarian moment.
You want to add to that?
No, I think I agree with that.
Another question, yes.
I
Can you speak into
well,
this?
it's not worth being on TV.
Okay. Well, then I want you to double check if it's worth asking.
Remember, the revolution doesn't have to be televised.
Okay.
So this morning, my mail came, and the New Yorker came, and there is a massive article by Dick DeFilkins on everything we're talking about tonight.
Yeah.
And before I ask my question, I want to know if anybody has seen it.
No, I
You've
did.
read
Read
it.
it.
Oh, good. So, what I'm interested in is what is your take on his thing? And it isn't fair because everybody else hasn't read it, but one of the things I take out of it that I'd like to know what you think is he puts a lot on the relationship between Jared Kushner and what is it, MSB? MBS, pardon me, and their relationship. It gives the impression that Trump has turned over all plans for the Middle East to Jared. And the two of these, 30-somethings are with no background or experience, and both of whom, and you mentioned something about the petrodollars, and I got the impression you thought that Saudi Arabia was okay economically. The article claims that the price of oil's gone down, that Saudi Arabia now has humongous expenses and needs to raise money because they've educated all these people, they need jobs, and they don't have money. And so Jared loves to go out raising money, and MSB, they're sort of, it's like crony capitalism, and almost without any regard for what's really going on in terms of countries or policies.
And Jared's own position in the White House is also somewhat shaky.
Well, I would just say that I would try and avoid kind of New York is great at some things, and one of them is kind of giving you kind of a personality insight into kind of behind policy. Saudi Arabia has racked up massive debts, right? The war in Yemen is costing it a lot, right? Many in the room may or may not be familiar. One of the things that the Crown Prince did when he came in was he did a widespread arrest of a number of leading princes, and it was effectively a shakedown, something to the tune of, it appears, some of the stories range around $100 billion, basically was taken from a number of the princes. For the
description of how he did it is something else.
Right. So this was, a number of princes were arrested, there are reports of torture, there are reports that the only way you could get out. I'm sorry, can you not hear me? Yeah.
I couldn't tell if you were saying million or
Billion.
Billion.
Yeah,
That's what I thought.
yeah, 100 million is not worth it, right? Yeah, that's chunky, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, this would be 100 billion with a B. So, but again, these are just reports. None of this is verified, and there's a reason for that. So, what we do know is that some of the leading princes, including one of the wealthiest men in the world, is not allowed to speak to reporters. They appear to be wearing ankle bracelets so that people know they're constantly monitored where they're going. They're not allowed to do interviews, etc. But Saudi Arabia is in financial trouble, right? So then why is it buying large numbers of weapons, right? So it comes back again and again. This is the same thing Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's been in this trouble before. It was in this trouble in the 80s. It continues on the same path, right? Saudi Arabia does not have a diversified economy, okay? So part of what the Crown Prince has said he's going to do is help diversify that economy. This is part of this kind of what he called an anti-corruption campaign. But you should also know that as part of his anti-corruption campaign, but separate from it, he went out and he bought a $500 million yacht that was with an M, not a B, and a Da Vinci painting. Okay, so this is not exactly someone who's really worried about living an austere lifestyle, like many of the Saudi crown princes before him, or really that interested in anti-corruption, anti-graft. The other thing I will throw out is this: virtually everything he's touched has been a disaster. Okay, the war in Yemen is his, right? The siege on Qatar is his idea as well. That's not going well. They haven't broken Qatar yet. Okay, he attempted to kidnap the Lebanese prime minister. That failed. So over and over again, he's done a number of things that have not succeeded. It's unclear that this, before he launched his anti-corruption campaign, quote unquote, he unveiled an idea for a fully automated technological city that apparently, one of the things that upset him was nobody bought into the idea, and that's why he launched this corruption campaign. Apparently his payback. That's one idea that's running around, one of the rumors. So he's not exactly, in spite of, and this is what I would warn everybody in the room about. Thomas Friedman, the New York Times, so I'm sure a number of you read, wrote a glowing profile of bin Salman. The Atlantic has also done basically propaganda pieces on it. The British newspapers, The Guardian, right, who was supposed to be at the left, has also run a number of very favorable. So the Saudi propaganda arm is very well funded.
The article said they hired giant PR firms that are drafting these articles.
Yeah. I mean, this is what they do, right? So you're going to read a lot of positive things about him that may, or more often than not, are not true. So I think I would just use a healthy dose of skepticism, considering what he's been involved in and how poorly he's performed.
Yeah, so I certainly agree with that last caution, and I just want to make a few kind of footnotey points. So, another thing that it's easy, perhaps. I keep using the word authoritarianism, or authoritarian leaders, and I mean, I am really under the belief that we are at a particular political moment in which sort of elements of political authoritarianism are really on the ascendance all over the world, and it's important, and it's a dynamic that is a shift, and at the same time, I mean, along the lines of continuity, and I spent so my degrees are a law degree and a PhD in political science. So my political science background is comparative politics, and having thought about democratization and democracy for decades, I mean, I think it's really important not to think that there's this moment when everything is going democratic, or everything is democratic, and now there's this moment where everything is authoritarian. I mean, the impulses towards self-determination, the impulses towards deferring to some, knowing leader are always happening, and happening in any particular political system. But where I say that because I actually do think that the Dexter Filkins article's sort of emphasis on personalities, again, of course, it's an accessible read, but it's significant in the sense that what we are seeing in this kind of current authoritarian moment is leaders like MBS who really are, doing everything they can to get rid of any sort of dissent, and then they have themselves and the people that listen to them, and of course Trump is another one, on whom to rely. So, it's not that all of Saudi politics boils down, or all of U.S. Middle Eastern relations boil down to the relation between Jared Kushner and MBS. But it is the case that, in an atmosphere where there isn't a lot of accountability, and there is nepotism, and again, I'm talking about the United States now more than even Saudi Arabia, that, the deals and the initiatives that two powerful people can make can have these really out of proportion ramifications. So again, this is, I mean, I don't want to put all, we wouldn't want to put all the political scientists to work on the multi-structural layers of all these countries out of business, but I do think there's something to the weirdness of, the personal chemistry between these young folks. And yes, young people, you don't have to wait and pay your dues, have several $billion, and at the age of 30, you can change the world too. There is something that's really significant about this, and it's really dangerous because, Kushner, Jared Kushner, what does he know about the Middle East? He says, I have a fresh approach. I'll just talk to people, and they'll tell me what I need to know. And exactly as Osama said, and much of what MBS has done has been disastrous. So I think we actually do have to focus on the way in which, again, very much agreeing with this point that what's happening in Saudi Arabia is less about, liberalizing, as Thomas Friedman put it, and really about, consolidating control, and I think, maybe changing kind of the tenor of society in a more culturally and socially expressive way, but really, reining in any kind of political dissent so that a small group of people can make all the decisions. And we do want to focus on the danger of that small group of people who, may not know what the heck they're doing, but are sure causing the rest of the world a heck of a lot of grief.
One of you gentlemen said something about that Trump likes to act crazy, that gives him some power. Think about Muhammad Ali had a similar operation. But he seems to be surrounding himself with more and more yes men, that nobody pushes back, because that would break into the power of being crazy. So is somebody like Bolton just he's one of my crazies, and we don't have any more fear, or is it getting more scary to have people like that whispering in Trump's ear?
Well, I mean, it's definitely, I think it goes back to the UN question also. I mean, so let's remember what Bolton was a recess appointment. Amanda had talked about how the UN needed to be dismantled. He was, one of these key figures behind at least the justification for the war in Iraq, justifying some of the rationale for it. I do think the tenor of it is troubling. Okay, so I'll say that. The tenor of it is troubling. It's hard to know because of the turnover within the Trump administration. I mean, they don't stay very long. So, and I think some of that is, he's not an easy person to get along with. He does have these flights of, he goes hot and cold on people. He does, as I mentioned earlier, he values loyalists. And it may be that he wants to give an appearance of toughness, but he doesn't actually, we went through this up until 2014. Benjamin Netanyahu was very similar, right? He was always threatening to be the tough guy, and he would never quite do it. And then 2014 came, and he actually did it, right? So on the one hand, it could be a signal that something very troubling is happening, is coming, both towards North Korea or towards Iran. My hope is that's not the case. As I mentioned, I made a joke that we do have. He apparently has a decent relationship with Mattis, as Secretary of Defense. Hopefully that will rein him in a bit. Hopefully the institutions, we keep talking about we haven't talked a lot about institutions, but hopefully the institutions of the Pentagon and the generals. I mean, one of the things we haven't. So I want to kind of again bring us back because we talked about Bolton and Iraq during the Bush period. Some of the room may remember that by 2007, Cheney was pushing for an attack on Iraq. And there was what they called basically the mutiny of the generals. So the Air Force came in, and mostly the Army actually threatened a mass resignation on Bush, is at least the rumor that was spread to the press. So these were, so this is the question about how do you know what Hillary Clinton thought about, right? So these are strategic rumors that are leaked, right? So usually to the Washington Post or the New York Times, and they're published. So we have this mutiny of the generals, which was, if you attack Iran, we will all resign. This whole clique will resign, and we will go and tell our stories on the Sunday morning shows that nobody watches anymore. They have to go on NPR to bring us back to the beginning. So what you're hoping for is something like that, right? That the institutions hold. And to be clear, and back to the UN case, look, we've witnessed just in the past year, ISIS was defeated in Mosul and in Raqqa, but there is no rebuilding going on, right? The U.S. is not rebuilding Mosul. It was devastated. Raqqa will take a long time to rebuild. It's unlikely to get rebuilt. The Syrians will have to do it. So, the U.S. is still, it's bogged down in Yemen with the Saudis. Do they want to extend that war? Again, this is very Nixonian. How do you win the war in Yemen? You extend it. But this time you're extending it with a much bigger foe. And the Iranians have made it very clear. If they are attacked, they will launch missiles at Saudi oil facilities, which means basically oil prices, the global economy will collapse, right? So they made it very clear that any attack on them, and they have the capability to do it, will mean the collapse of the global economy. Right, so they will make the Persian Gulf oil very difficult to get. So this is a very different rationale and strategic rationale that would be needed to attack Iran than you needed for Iraq. Right? And the Iranians have been very, very specific about this, about what they're going to, and they have sent those messages openly as well as through private channels, that we will not go quietly.
Yeah, I saw a lot of other hands, and so I won't say much other than, so on the topic of, what can constrain people in the Trump administration. I do think that we have to watch. I don't think we can. I think it is hard to predict how unpredictable he is and whether having all these yes men. What it's going to mean. The things that I think really have pushed back include, and I think it really is important to emphasize this, so I'll echo Osama, include people in the military, people in the Pentagon, for all that it's especially easy for us out here to see the military as some kind of amorphous, large entity that must be enjoying getting increasing funding. I mean, people that have to order troops into battle and think about the logistics of prosecuting war, have more at stake, and I think we really have seen pushback, and that's important. Lower federal courts and other courts, we have seen some real pushback. And again, sort of the scary thing about Trump winning is indeed that the more federal judges that he appoints, and obviously we know this from the Supreme Court especially, the less, in the long run, the kind of real resistance. I mean, again, I would use the word resistance. I mean, when you read the court opinions of federal judges striking down versions of the Muslim ban or taking issue with a particular deportation case, you are seeing. I'm so used to seeing very moderate, legal language as a lawyer. I mean, you're seeing resistance. The fact that Trump is sort of inept in many ways is helpful, because it does mean that policies don't necessarily have time to take hold. And I mean, it is, and obviously people outside notice, and and certainly people in other countries notice, and so, world leaders are not taking him very seriously. The media, the media that we read, this is very significant. And this is why the Sinclair, I made a joke about Sinclair media, but, if you saw that montage of Sinclair editorial, Sinclair news anchors reciting in unison the same Orwellian, message about fake media, you should be scared. I mean, I'm very scared by this, because we've seen a lot of documentation about what the Trump administration is doing, and finally, the mass mobilization of people about specific things. So these are all things that I think are pushing back, and I put more faith in all of them than I do, what anybody in the administration will or won't do.
Another question? Yes. Both of you in either order.
Let's have a husband.
Here. Let's have a young'un.
Future Jared Kushner.
I don't know whether he wants to be called that.
Sorry.
So what is the predicament that America is seeing its State Department, its diplomats being replaced effectively by the military? And how does that affect not only our views with, or our relationship with the Middle East, but with the world as a whole, if America's first face is its military and not its diplomats?
So I brought with me, the latest issue of Foreign Policy, which came out, which I got today, which also talks a lot about, not coincidentally, the end of human rights, and has some good articles, has a nice map here, which you can't see, but I'm happy for people to look at, that shows where the United States has ambassadors at the moment. And there are all these countries in red that do not have ambassadors, and I guess the brown ones, there are no diplomatic relations. But you can see there's a lot of countries where there aren't even ambassadors. So, the premise of your question is cogent and, critical. And again, I think that in a way, there's two answers to the question, which may or may not be bad things in terms of global history in the long run. We'll see. One is by taking away available tools of getting local knowledge and, carrying out diplomacy, the things that people talk about as soft power, various ways of trying to actually understand and influence, other states. By doing that, Trump is leaving his administration with one, or I guess two tools. One is threatening force, and the other is using force. And that's not a lot to base U.S. policy on. Now, whether that will lead to war, again, this has to do more with the fact that there are these, that these people don't really know a lot what they're doing, and will they be checked by others? I mean, I don't know. But, I mean, it certainly means that U.S., at least I think, to the extent that U.S. foreign policy is about pursuing a variety of ends, U.S. foreign policy is going to be less effective. I mean, it only has, two things it can do. And, the second point is, I think that as I believe was true for the Iraq invasion, I mean, this is hastening the demise of U.S. power in the world. Now, that may not be a bad thing. I mean, maybe we need other countries to be less self-righteous about their values and, in principle and sort of, more pragmatic in practice. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of, I don't want to make a point about whether I think U.S. power can be a good thing, but, this is sort of, pardon the metaphor, the U.S. shooting itself in the foot. And I'm sure that there are people in other countries that are thinking, okay, good, this is what we need, a different kind of world. But it isn't, I mean, certainly if American power, and hegemony in the world is one's goal, it isn't necessarily mine, this is not working in that direction.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I would add a couple of things on certain trend lines, right? So one of this fits in with the question about Bolton, et cetera. And David already hit on this in a way, where we're seeing positions are not being filled in the State Department at varying levels, right? So one of the jobs of the Secretary of State, and then really the Deputy Secretaries, is really to manage the bureaucracy, right? Depends how active a president you want on foreign policy, right? So one of the things they're supposed to do is manage that bureaucracy, which is huge. So if those positions are not being filled, it means that the institutional memory itself is actually lost, and the ability to respond to events, right? Foreign policy tends to be very reactive in the U.S. It's not, there's very few of them come in with a grand strategy. One of the few that did it was Nixon, right? So in that case, what you end up seeing is not just his institutional memory lost, right, but the ability to respond even to events or even to respond to anything other than, tariff fights or many of the things that the president is starting on Twitter. And this is another question, is policy being made in these pronouncements on Twitter, right? There's another trend line that, came up actually at dinner, which is we have a history here of interventions abroad in which the military has been the face of the United States over and over again. And even though there's supposed to be this kind of brick wall between the diplomats and the military and intelligence, even at the embassy, we know whether it was Vietnam or the embassy in Baghdad, there's a lot of interaction back and forth, right, between those three bodies. But the reality is that the U.S. military has been the face of the United States in many parts of the world, and that's also deliberate, right? That's also a deliberate policy. And the State Department has often been kind of running behind them to interact at the diplomatic level. And this is especially since 9/11. If you even look at how, there's a map I show my students of kind of the different U.S. commands around the globe. And so the U.S. has global commands, and then it has specific Central Command, Africa Command, and so that are targeted at specific regions. It's an amazing map, right? It's an amazing map. That's how the U.S. views the world, right? That's one way you can think of that, in which the world is literally divided up into these different military commands. So this is, for a large part, the way the U.S. has interacted with the world since the Cold War started, since the end of World War II and since the Cold War started, and has expanded since 9/11. Right?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Now let's take one more question. This is our something-minute warning.
So this is an easy question, I think. My question is, what's the best way to keep up on Middle East news? And I'm going to mention a couple of things that I use. You mentioned a couple organizations earlier, but kind of news sources. So I subscribe to Haaretz newspaper, and you can read it online. And Al Jazeera sometimes I look at. But what else? What would be the legacy?
That's a great closing question.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Al Jazeera. I mean, I think that there are lots of interesting columns that you can see there. Middle East Monitor is another one. There's
Is it Middle East Monitor or Al Monitor?
Oh, Al Monitor, right, that's it. Yeah, Al Monitor, right. You know, I also, I mean, I write for The Conversation. The Conversation has some good pieces, although they're, you know, it's mostly Americans writing.
The Conversation?
The Conversation. It's academics sort of edited by journalists. The Conversation. It's actually run by a friend who's in Boston, so it's a local kind of thing. There's a website called Jadalia, which is also actually, there's a real Valley presence, which is a group of academics and journalists and students that sort of publish, I think, you know, important pieces and on Middle Eastern and Arab politics. I mean, I think that human rights organizations also are important. There are also lots of important, decent pieces in, you know, U.S. newspapers. I mean, and I think you have to, it's sort of like, I mean, I agree with Osama that you know, Thomas Friedman should be taken with many, many grains of salt. I mean, you know, on my Facebook feed tends to have a lot of Middle Eastern studies friends and colleagues posting things, and, you know, a Thomas Friedman post is always about, oh my God, how could he have written this? And I certainly, with respect to his, you know, his bromance with Mohammed bin Salman, which he's really been defending, by the way. You know, that this is a problem. But I don't think it's impossible to find in U.S. media a good bit of stuff. I mean, I also read Haaretz. As long as you are, you know, Al Jazeera and some of these other sort of more, like things like Al Monitor that are actually more Middle Eastern. And, you know, there's a lot of blogs. There's a lot of good, like on Syria, there've been a lot of good kind of books that bring together different people's individual accounts. So there's, you know, there's no shortage of books and media, and I mean, a lot of it is really, I mean, I would say whenever you hear the term, most of the time, and this happens a lot in NPR actually, whenever you hear the term fundamentalist, extremist,
Islamic radical terrorism.
Whenever you hear terms like that, and they seem like, well, what do they actually mean? You know, that's a good source to question and flip away from.
Yeah, well said.
So in addition to Breitbart, which I think is a must-read for everyone,
Fox and Friends.
Just making sure you're awake. I agree with a number of the suggestions from David. I would add a couple of things. So 972 Mag, which is Israeli website. If you want a Palestinian perspective, there is Electronic Intifada. If you know it, there's also an organization I helped co-found called Shebeka, which is a Palestinian think tank. I would also recommend Middle East Eye. And for those of you Middle East Eye, which is UK based, Middle East MEE, Middle East Eye, I as an I, right? And then Middle East Monitor is another decent one. You know, there's a couple of the National out of the UAE is written in English. It has some, its opinion page is okay if you want to get kind of a Gulf perspective, particularly generally biased perspective on the Gulf. You can take a look at the National, for those of you who read English. For Arabic, if you want some Arabic sites, I can give you some of those as well. But I think that's a broad enough collection, I think, that you can, to get an understanding if you're missing anything.
Thank you, both of you, so much for your expert analysis. And thank you all for coming tonight and braving the, at first, rainy weather. This was a really well-attended event, and we'd like to thank you all. I'd like to make you aware of some of our future events coming up. On April 22nd, we have our Combatants for Peace event with a group that's trying to help bring peace to Israel and Palestine. They'll be at the Islamic Center in Western Springfield. So please join us for that. And then on May 25th, we have our next Building Inclusive Community Symposium. And this one is about bringing law enforcement and communities of color together to hopefully bridge some divides there. So thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. And please follow our Facebook and see more info at our website, criticalconnections.org. Thank you.